If you're having trouble with ands and ors and conditional statements on the LSAT, you could be leaving points on the table. Let's start with the definitions, because if you don't have the definitions down, things can get very shaky from there. A logical function is something that takes one or more true-false values as inputs and generates a single true-false output. And or are both logical functions and should be thought of as such on the exam. And every single component must be true simultaneously for the whole statement to be true. If one part is false, the function evaluates to false. Or, the LSAT uses the inclusive or as opposed to the exclusive or. If at least one input is true, then the function evaluates to true. However, if all inputs are false, the function evaluates to false. And this sentence here, this is the only time that or would evaluate to false. If all the inputs are true, the output of or would be true as well. A sufficient condition, you'll hear me refer to this as the trigger. If this happens, the necessary must also happen. Necessary condition is the requirement. This must be true for the trigger to have happened. Let's look at what happens when we have and or in the sufficient condition, and let's see how they behave differently. Okay, starting on the left, and in the sufficient. If you have a valid ticket and a photo ID, you are permitted to enter the stadium. So this is a two-part trigger, V, and I'll use I for photo ID, arrow S. V on its own doesn't trigger the rule. I on its own doesn't trigger the rule. V and I together is what triggers the rule. And then you'd have to go across the arrow and say the S also has to be satisfied. Okay, but if you had V on its own, you wouldn't go across the arrow. On the right-hand side, or in the sufficient condition, if you have a VIP pass, so I'll use a P for the pass, or a press badge, I'll use a B for the press badge. You are permitted to enter the stadium, I'll use an S for stadium. The logic here is that the or in the sufficient condition splits the two components into separate sufficient conditions, meaning P on its own is enough to trigger the rule, B on its own is enough to trigger the rule. Next, let's look at what happens when we have and or in the necessary condition. Starting with the left again, if there's an and in the necessary, here's an example. If you win the gold medal, you must attend the ceremony and submit to a drug test. Okay, so G is the trigger, and there are two separate requirements. By separate, I mean they are completely independent of one another. So one of the requirements is that you have to attend the ceremony. We can use an A for this. And the other requirement is that you have to submit to a drug test. I can use a D for that. So it's one trigger that generates two facts. Okay. On the right side, we have an or in the necessary condition. If you win the gold medal, you will receive a cash prize or a commemorative plaque. So G, C, or P. Okay. The logic here is that if the rule is triggered, at least one part of the necessary condition must be satisfied, but you can't infer which one. So if you win the gold medal, you have to get either a cash prize or a commemorative plaque. And since the LSAT uses the inclusive or, you could also get both. Next, let's do a quick overview on how to negate and statements and or statements. When negating an and statement, you negate each term and change the and to an or. Here's an example. You are happy and you are rich. The negation becomes you are not happy or you are not rich. So the and changes to an or. The first component is negated and the second component is negated as well. When negating or statements, negate each term and change the or to an and. Very similar to the above. You are a resident or have a local business license becomes you are not a resident and you do not have a local business license. Now that we've done an overview of negation, we can talk about contrapositives. When you take the contrapositive of a conditional statement that has ands and ors, you have to reverse the sufficient and necessary conditions, and you have to negate both of them. It's the same process as taking a regular conditional. The difference here is that you also need to negate the and or statement, which we discussed on the last slide. Okay, so let's look at examples here. So if there's an and in the sufficient condition, it will become an or in the necessary condition, and both of these are diagrammed with one arrow. If you eat peanuts and shellfish, you will have an allergic reaction. P and S, arrow A. To take the contrapositive, we'll reverse and negate. If you did not have an allergic reaction, then you did not eat peanuts or you did not eat shellfish. Okay. And notice how, as we described, an and in the sufficient condition will become an or in the necessary, and both are diagrammed with one arrow. Okay. Or in the sufficient condition becomes and in the necessary, and both of these are diagrammed with two arrows. Here's an example of that. If you eat peanuts or shellfish, you will have an allergic reaction. The contrapositive, again, reverse and negate. If you do not have an allergic reaction, then you did not eat peanuts and you did not eat shellfish. Okay. Here there's an or, but we don't need to write it down because we have two arrows, and this one is an and, but again, we don't need to write it down because we have two arrows. Okay, next, let's look at an example of a conditional chain that uses and or. I want you to pause and try this on your own. Okay, so if you are a manager or a director, this is the sufficient, M, D. You have keycard access. If you have keycard access, you are permitted to enter the server room and view the logs. So entering the server room, I'll diagram that with an S, and view the logs, I'll diagram that with an L. If you are authorized to view the logs, you are responsible for the security audit. Being responsible for the security audit, I'll diagram that with A. Okay, and then we have this question. Sarah is a director, so that triggers the D. Is she responsible for the security audit? The answer is yes. Because if D is true, we move across that arrow. That means K has to be true. That means L has to be true. That means that A has to be true. That's what the question is discussing. We can also say that the S is true. That's a valid inference. It's just not what the question is asking. The one thing we cannot comment about is the M. We don't know if she's a manager. The question doesn't say that if you are a director, you can't be a manager. So it leaves the possibility open that you could be both. Okay. Here's another example. Again, I want you to pause and try it for yourself. If you're a full-time employee, you must receive a company laptop. So F arrow, so F for full-time employee, arrow, C for company laptop. If you have a company laptop, you must install antivirus software and encryption. We have an and in the necessary, so that's going to be two arrows like we discussed. So we have A for antivirus encryption. Antivirus software, A for antivirus software, and E for encryption. If you have encryption, you must use a physical key or a biometric scan. So I'll use P for physical key, or in the necessary, you do need to write the word or. You have to use one arrow here. So we have physical key or biometric scan. I'll use a B for that. Okay. So with this conditional here, which was sentence 2, we had an and in the necessary condition. We diagrammed that with 2 arrows. And in sentence 3, we had an or in the necessary condition. And that is diagrammed with 1 arrow. Okay. Now we have this question. Mark is a full-time employee. That's F. So F evaluates a true. Who does not use a biometric scan. Okay, so that means F is satisfied, but B is not satisfied. Okay? What else must be true about Mark? Well, if Mark is a full-time employee, he has to have a company laptop. So the C is true. He has to have antivirus software. The A is true. He has to have encryption. The E is true. And this is where it gets very interesting. If you have encryption, you need to have P or B. The P stands for physical key. The B stands for biometric scan. The question says he does not use a biometric scan. So that means he's forced to use the physical key. So these 4 things are all inferences. Okay, let's look at one more example. To qualify for the fellowship, a student must have published a paper and have a faculty nomination. Okay, so since there's an and in the necessary, we'll diagram this with 2 arrows. So F is qualifying for the fellowship. P, the student published a paper. And we'll use N, the student has a faculty nomination. Any student with a published paper will receive a research grant. R stands for research grant. Getting a faculty nomination requires top-tier grades. T for top-tier grades. This is very interesting because diagramming the and in the necessary with 2 arrows allows us to continue to connect the variables in our chain. If I had diagrammed it with a single arrow like this, F arrow, P and N, it now becomes very awkward to connect the R and the T. Because, for example, if I try to connect the R, what ends up happening is that I might misinterpret what I have written here, because now it looks like P and N is the trigger for R. But the question says that N is the trigger for R. So splitting it into 2 arrows makes the next connections much cleaner.